The judge threatened to remove his daughter when Khalil Benning corrected one word. Would grain under his palms. Fluorescent hum overhead. Behind him, Avery gripped her backpack while a deputy's hand drifted toward his belt. The court reporter's fingers slowed. Everyone knew what came after manufacturing meaning in open court. But the language tests weren't about contempt. They were federal identification, designed to confirm Khalil could decode county boundaries from audio and recognize labor trafficking routes. Operational knowledge that shouldn't exist in a warehouse worker. The car crash that killed his wife 7 years ago. A cover story. Raina Sutter was a military translator who identified supervisors staging industrial accidents to silence workers scheduled for federal interviews. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before someone you trust teaches your child a phrase you don't recognize. Because Khalil just discovered the watcher didn't just surveil his daughter. He taught Avery coded instructions, and the threat has been living in her memory for weeks. You're manufacturing meaning, Judge Patrice Harlow said, and the words carried across the Franklin County courtroom in Columbus with the kind of deliberate flatness that informed everyone present she wasn't opening a debate. The prosecutor leaned against the rail with her arms crossed, waiting, and the court reporter's fingers slowed on the keys because anyone who had sat through more than 3 criminal dockets understood what came after a judge accused someone of manufacturing meaning in open court: contempt, remand, a child taken to a hallway by a deputy who wouldn't look at her because looking would require admitting what the system was about to do. Khalil Benning stayed seated with his hands open on the table, fingers spread to show he wasn't reaching for anything, shoulders squared the way men square themselves when the room has already decided what they are. The wood grain under his palms was smooth from decades of other defendants pressing their weight into the same spot, and the fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a frequency that made the air feel thick enough to choke on if you breathed too deeply. He didn't look at his public defender, Iris Tremaine, who had grabbed his sleeve 3 times in the last 10 minutes to stop him from speaking, and he didn't look at the bailiff near the side door, because that bailiff's hand had already shifted closer to his belt in a gesture so practiced it didn't register as threatening until you realized it was aimed at a man sitting perfectly still. You didn't correct the interpreter, Judge Harlow continued, voice sharpening now. You rewrote the record. She glanced toward the public benches where a few attorneys from other dockets had paused mid-whisper to watch, because a black single father challenging a courtroom carried the same gravity as a car slowing for a wreck. That's tampering. That's obstruction. And if you think standing up in my court and contradicting a certified state interpreter makes you credible, you're more arrogant than I thought. Behind Khalil, his daughter Avery sat in a thrift store cardigan 2 sizes too big, the cuffs pulled down over her knuckles. Her school backpack balanced on her knees like a shield she couldn't put down even though the straps were digging into her thighs. She kept her eyes locked on the back of her father's head, not blinking, memorizing the angle of his shoulders and the small patch of gray near his temple in case the state removed him from her life in the next 60 seconds. The recycled air in the courtroom smelled like wood polish and old carpet, and the faint metallic tang of panic that people leave behind in places where their futures get decided by strangers. Prosecutor Nina Slocum straightened from the rail and spoke for the first time since the judge had started her attack. Your Honor, the defendant interrupted official court proceedings to challenge a translation provided by a professional with 8 years of certification. He's not qualified. He has no credentials. This is textbook witness intimidation and jury confusion. Her tone suggested she'd been waiting for this moment, that the entire morning had been building toward giving Khalil enough rope to justify what came next. Khalil's public defender stood, finally, but her voice came out thin. Your Honor, my client was simply noting. Your client, Judge Harlow cut in, was manufacturing his own version of evidence. And now I'm going to find out if he's a liar or just dangerously overconfident. She turned her attention back to Khalil, and the shift in her expression was the kind that made courthouse staff nervous, because it wasn't anger, it was entertainment. You think you're fluent? You think you caught an error that a state-certified interpreter missed? The bailiff near Avery shifted his weight, and Khalil's eyes flicked toward him for half a second before returning to the judge. The calculation in that glance was visible to anyone paying attention. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was measuring how quickly they could separate him from his daughter if the judge decided to escalate this into an arrest. Avery's fingers tightened on the straps of her backpack, and the small motion carried more weight than anything the adults in the room had said aloud, because it was the gesture of a child who had already learned that the people with power don't ask permission before they rearrange your life. Subscribe before you miss the moment a single accusation decides who gets believed and who gets erased. Judge Harlow tapped one finger on the bench, a rhythm that suggested she was enjoying the authority more than the justice. Here's what's going to happen. I'm calling the state interpreter coordinator right now. I'm ordering evaluators from Delaware County, from Licking County, from Montgomery County. You're going to sit in this courtroom and prove your competence in any language they choose to test you on. She paused, letting the threat settle into the air. And if you fail even once, if you get even one translation wrong, I will treat your interruption today as intentional deception, and I will refer this matter for additional charges. Obstruction, perjury, witness tampering. The public defender opened her mouth, then closed it, because there was no procedural objection that would stop a judge who had decided to make an example out of someone. Prosecutor Slocum's expression didn't change, but her posture relaxed slightly, the way a person relaxes when they realize the outcome has already been written and all that's left is watching it play out. The court reporter's hands returned to the keys, but slower now, as if she understood she was transcribing something that would be cited later in ways none of them could predict yet. Khalil didn't move. He didn't protest or apologize or try to explain. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his daughter's eyes burning into the back of his skull, and the room waited for him to break under the weight of what the judge had just threatened, because that's what rooms like this are designed to do. They wait for you to flinch, to beg, to show the fear that justifies their authority. The clerk's phone rang, and Judge Harlow answered it without taking her eyes off Khalil. She spoke quietly, too quietly for the gallery to hear, but the way her mouth moved suggested she was already coordinating the evaluators, already setting the trap. When she hung up, she leaned forward slightly, and the fluorescent lights caught the angles of her face in a way that made her look less like a jurist and more like someone who had forgotten that fairness was supposed to be part of the performance. One more thing, she added, almost as an afterthought. If you fail, your daughter stays here until we determine appropriate placement. The words landed like a sentencing, clinical and final, and Avery's breath caught in a way that was audible only to the people in the row directly behind her. The deputy near the side door straightened, not because he'd been given an order yet, but because he recognized the phrasing that preceded one. Khalil's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the judge had started speaking, his hands moved. Not dramatically, just a slight shift in the way his fingers pressed into the wood, like he was anchoring himself to something solid before the current pulled him under. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried in a way that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward without realizing they were doing it. Test me in any language. The first evaluator walked through the courtroom doors 23 minutes after Judge Harlow made the call, which meant she'd been waiting somewhere close. Maybe in the building already, and that realization landed in Khalil's chest like cold water, because spontaneous tests don't come with specialists on standby. The woman carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore a lanyard thick with courthouse identification cards from counties Khalil recognized: Hamilton, Cuyahoga, Summit, the kind of credentials that told you she'd testified in rooms like this hundreds of times and knew exactly how much authority a judge could stretch before it snapped. She didn't look at Khalil when she entered. She looked at Judge Harlow, nodded once, and began setting up a small digital recorder on the prosecution's table with the efficiency of someone who had done this enough times to make it muscle memory. Khalil watched her hands move, connecting cables, adjusting volume levels, opening a file on a tablet, and the mechanical precision of it pulled him back to a loading dock in Moraine, just outside Dayton, where a supervisor named Esteban Ruiz had shown him how to spot the difference between a safety briefing that mattered and one designed to create plausible deniability. Esteban had been the kind of man who translated instructions twice, once in the language the company required, and once in the language that kept people alive, and he'd taught Khalil that the gap between those two versions was where blame got assigned when something went wrong. The phrase Esteban used most often, no es permiso, es presión, had saved Khalil from signing off on faulty equipment 3 times in 2 years, because he'd learned to hear the difference between a worker agreeing to a risk and a worker being cornered into one. The evaluator's tablet screen glowed with a waveform, and Khalil understood she was about to play audio, which meant this wasn't going to be a vocabulary test or a translation exercise pulled from a textbook. This was going to be context-dependent, high-speed, the kind of language that only made sense if you'd heard it used under pressure. His public defender leaned close and whispered, "Don't volunteer anything. Answer exactly what she asks and nothing more." But Iris Tremaine didn't understand that staying quiet wasn't an option anymore, because the judge had already framed silence as guilt and competence as arrogance, which meant the only move left was to prove he wasn't lying even though the system had already decided it didn't want to be proven wrong. Avery shifted in her seat behind him, and Khalil heard the faint rasp of her inhaler strap adjusting against the backpack fabric, a sound so small it shouldn't have carried over the courtroom's ventilation hum, but did anyway, because he'd trained himself to track it the way other parents track a baby's breathing. She'd had the inhaler since she was 6, after a respiratory infection turned chronic, and the sound of her checking it without using it meant she was managing fear the way he'd taught her to, quietly, without asking adults for permission to feel what she was feeling. The case itself had started with a warehouse explosion outside Grove City 3 months ago, the kind of industrial accident that made local news for 2 days before disappearing under the weight of more immediate disasters. A forklift operator named Maceo Tull had been killed when a storage unit ignited during a night shift, and the company's initial report had been clean, efficient, uncontestable. Gas leak, human error, no prior warnings, nobody to blame except the dead man, and maybe the contractor who'd installed the faulty valve. But Khalil had been on a recorded call the night before the explosion, a call the state had subpoenaed as part of a broader labor investigation. And when the prosecutor's office matched his voice to the recording, they built a narrative that fit their case better than it fit the truth. The interpreter's translation had turned a warning into complicity, a moment of resistance into evidence of conspiracy, and now Khalil was sitting in a courtroom defending himself against a death he'd tried to prevent. The evaluator finally looked up from her tablet and spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the neutral authority of someone who had learned not to show sympathy in rooms where sympathy could be mistaken for bias. "Mr. Benning, I'm going to play a recording. It's 43 seconds long. I'll play it once, and then I'll ask you to translate it into English. You will not be given a transcript. You will not be allowed to replay it. Do you understand?" Khalil nodded, and the evaluator pressed play. The audio was poor quality, compressed, and distant, the kind of recording made on a phone held too far from the speakers during a conversation nobody was supposed to be documenting. 2 voices, both male, both speaking Spanish fast enough that the syllables blurred at the edges. Khalil closed his eyes and let the rhythm settle into his ears, tracking the cadence and the breath patterns the way Esteban had taught him. Because people don't just speak words, they speak urgency, exhaustion, fear, leverage. And halfway through the recording, Khalil heard it. A second voice in the background, quieter, almost inaudible beneath the primary speakers, saying something the interpreter's transcript had never acknowledged existed. The evaluator stopped the playback and looked at Judge Harlow, who leaned forward with the expression of someone waiting for a defendant to disqualify himself. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Benning," she said. And the room fell silent in the way rooms fall silent when everyone understands that what comes next will be used as evidence regardless of whether it's true. Khalil translated the recording in 3 sentences, speaking slowly enough that the court reporter could capture every word. And when he finished, the evaluator's expression didn't change, but her fingers paused over the tablet for 2 seconds longer than they needed to, which was the only confirmation anyone in that room would get that his translation had been accurate. Judge Harlow's mouth tightened at the corners, not with satisfaction, but with the subtle irritation of someone who had expected a different outcome and now had to recalibrate her performance. The prosecutor glanced at her notes, then at the evaluator, waiting for some indication that Khalil had made a mistake she could exploit, but the evaluator simply moved to the next audio file without commentary, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the words that had come before it. The second test was Portuguese, and the evaluator didn't announce the switch. She just played the recording and let Khalil figure it out in real time, which was a tactic designed to catch people who had rehearsed specific translations but didn't actually understand linguistic structure. The audio was a conversation between two men discussing shipping logistics, and Khalil translated it with the same measured precision, noting the difference between formal and colloquial phrasing in a way that made it clear he wasn't guessing. The courtroom's air conditioning kicked on with a low mechanical groan, pushing cold air through the vents near the ceiling, and the temperature drop was slight but noticeable, the kind that made people shift in their seats and cross their arms without realizing they were doing it. Behind Khalil, Avery leaned forward slightly and whispered something under her breath, too quiet for most of the room to hear, but Khalil caught it because he'd spent 9 years learning the exact frequency of his daughter's voice. She'd repeated one of the Portuguese phrases he'd just translated, not perfectly but close enough to show she'd been absorbing the sounds and structure, and the realization hit him like a fist to the sternum. She'd been listening to him practice languages at home for years, during car rides and dinner prep and the late nights when he'd study union contracts in 3 different versions to make sure he wasn't signing away protections that only existed in the English text. He didn't turn to look at her, but his shoulders tensed in a way that the bailiff noticed, because the bailiff's hand drifted closer to his radio, as if preparing for some sudden movement that hadn't happened yet. The third test was Haitian Creole, and this time the evaluator's choice felt deliberate, designed to push Khalil outside the commercial languages he might have encountered through warehouse work. The recording was a heated argument, voices overlapping, and Khalil closed his eyes to separate the threads, tracking who was speaking and when, translating not just the words but the emotional weight behind them. Frustration, desperation, the specific cadence of someone trying to de-escalate a situation they knew was already lost. When he opened his eyes and delivered the translation, he added a detail the interpreter's original transcript had missed. The speaker wasn't agreeing to the terms being offered. He was stalling for time while someone else made a call in the background. It was a nuance that changed the power dynamic of the entire conversation, and Judge Harlow's smile vanished completely, replaced by something colder and more focused. Someone in the public gallery stood up and left through the rear doors, moving quickly enough that the motion drew attention, but not so quickly that it looked like panic, and Prosecutor Slocum's eyes tracked the exit with the kind of interest that suggested she recognized the person even if the rest of the room didn't. The door closed with a soft pneumatic hiss, sealing off the hallway beyond, and the sound created a strange sense of isolation, like the courtroom had just become a smaller and more dangerous space than it had been 30 seconds earlier. Khalil's hands were still flat on the table, but the fingers of his right hand had started to tremble, a small involuntary movement that he tried to suppress by pressing harder into the wood. His public defender noticed and slid a legal pad closer to him, a gesture that was meant to give him something to do with his hands, but only made the tremor more visible when he didn't reach for it. The evaluator ran a 4th test without warning, switching to French and asking him to summarize a legal deposition in English, and then convert his summary back into French using the same formal tone, because legal language had its own cruelty and its own traps. Words that sounded neutral in one language carried liability in another, and a single mistranslated verb could shift a contract from protection to waiver. Khalil completed the task, then stopped mid-sentence and corrected himself, pointing out that the deposition's original phrasing would have altered a liability clause in a way that contradicted the intent of the agreement. It was a detail too precise to be coincidence, too specific to be luck, and the evaluator's eyes flicked toward Judge Harlow with an expression that suggested this was no longer a simple competency test. It was something else, something neither of them had been briefed on before walking into this courtroom. Judge Harlow leaned back in her chair, and the leather creaked under her weight, a sound that felt amplified in the quiet. She didn't look entertained anymore. She looked like someone who had just realized the performance she'd been staging had an audience she hadn't accounted for. "How many languages do you speak, Mr. Benning?" she asked, and the question sounded conversational, almost polite, but the undertone was sharp enough to draw blood. "Enough," Khalil said, and the single word landed with more weight than a full explanation would have carried. Judge Harlow's expression hardened. "I want a language he couldn't possibly know," she said, speaking directly to the evaluator now, bypassing all pretense of judicial neutrality. "Call Columbus. Call the state coordinator. Find me someone who can test him on something he has no reason to have learned." The evaluator nodded, already reaching for her phone, and Khalil's hands finally moved, not to gesture or object, but to reach for the paper cup of water the bailiff had placed near his elbow 10 minutes earlier. His hand shook visibly as he lifted it, and water sloshed against the rim but didn't spill, and that single moment of visible fear told the truth the rest of his performance had tried to hide. Competence didn't cancel terror. It just forced you to function under it. The second evaluator arrived from Lucas County 40 minutes later, a man in his 50s with reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck and the tired posture of someone who had driven 2 hours to test a defendant the judge had already decided was guilty. He didn't introduce himself to Khalil or acknowledge Iris Tremaine's attempt at a greeting. He simply nodded to Judge Harlow, placed a slim briefcase on the prosecution's table, and pulled out a folder thick with annotated legal documents. The pages were marked with yellow tabs and handwritten notes and margins, the kind of preparation that suggested this wasn't a standard competency evaluation, but something more targeted, more personal. Judge Harlow straightened in her chair and spoke before the evaluator could begin, her voice carrying a new edge that made it clear she was done waiting for Khalil to fail naturally. Mr. Benning, this evaluator specializes in legal translation. You're going to read a paragraph from a deposition, summarize it in English, and then convert your summary back into French using the same formal legal tone. If you deviate from the tone, if you simplify the language, if you make it more accessible than the original, that's a failure. Do you understand? Khalil nodded, and the evaluator slid the document across the table without meeting his eyes. The paragraph was dense, written in the bureaucratic French used in international contracts, full of subordinate clauses and conditional phrasing designed to protect parties from liability while appearing to offer transparency. Khalil read it twice, slowly, then delivered his English summary in 3 sentences that preserved the legal architecture without losing the meaning. When he converted it back to French, he matched the original's rhythm and formality so precisely that the evaluator's pen stopped moving mid-note. And for 5 full seconds, the only sound in the courtroom was the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead and the scratch of the court reporter's fingers on the keys. Then Khalil did something that shifted the entire temperature of the room. He paused, looked up from the document, and said, "The original translation has an error. Line 4. The verb tense changes the liability window from 12 months to indefinite. That's not what the French version says. Someone altered it." The evaluator's face went still in a way that suggested Khalil had just said something he wasn't supposed to notice, let alone vocalize in open court. Prosecutor Slocum's head turned sharply toward the document, then toward Judge Harlow, and the judge's expression cycled through confusion, irritation, and something that looked uncomfortably close to alarm before settling back into control. The air in the courtroom felt thinner suddenly, like the ventilation system had stopped circulating oxygen, and people in the gallery shifted in their seats without understanding why the tension had just spiked. Judge Harlow opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, her clerk approached the bench from the side door, moving with the deliberate caution of someone carrying something that could detonate if handled wrong. The clerk leaned in close and murmured something too quiet for the room to hear, then placed a sealed manila envelope on the bench and stepped back as if distancing herself from whatever it contained. The envelope was unmarked except for a case number stamped in red ink across the top, and the format was wrong. It didn't match the county's filing system, didn't match the state system, didn't match anything Khalil had seen in 3 months of pretrial motions. Judge Harlow's hand hovered over the envelope for a moment before picking it up, and when she broke the seal and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside, her posture changed in a way that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward without realizing they were doing it. Her shoulders pulled back, her jaw tightened, and her eyes moved across the page with the slow, deliberate pace of someone reading words that couldn't be unread. She didn't announce the contents. She didn't explain the pause. She folded the paper once, placed it face down on the bench, and then looked at the bailiff near the side door with an expression that carried the weight of an order before any words were spoken. "Lock that door," she said, voice flat. "Jurors stay in the hallway." Public defender stepped back from the table. The bailiff moved immediately, and the side door's lock engaged with a metallic click that echoed in the sudden silence. Prosecutor Slocum's face had gone pale, not with confusion but with recognition, because she'd glanced at the envelope's case number format and understood what it meant even if the rest of the room didn't. The courtroom hadn't gotten louder after the judge's order. It had gotten quieter, the kind of quiet that happens when people realize they're witnessing something that wasn't supposed to happen in public, something that belonged in sealed chambers or redacted transcripts. Avery's breathing had changed behind Khalil, faster and shallower, and he knew without looking that her hand was on her inhaler now, not using it, but gripping it the way she gripped things when she needed an anchor. The deputy who had been standing near her shifted position slightly, not closer, but angled differently, and the change was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but clear enough to Khalil that he understood his daughter was being watched now, not casually, but with intent. Judge Harlow looked at the second evaluator and spoke with a carefully measured tone that suggested every word was being chosen for a record that might be reviewed later by people with more authority than she had. You're dismissed. Leave your materials. The court appreciates your time. The evaluator hesitated, glanced at his briefcase, then gathered only his personal items and left through the rear door without a word, and the speed of his exit told everyone watching that he'd just been given an order that overrode whatever instructions had brought him there in the first place. The judge turned her attention back to Khalil, and the look on her face had lost all traces of the performance she'd been staging for the past 2 hours. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posturing. She looked like someone who had just been handed a problem that didn't have a clean solution and was calculating which version of wrong would cost her the least. I'm going to allow one more evaluator, she said slowly, and then added, with a pause that made the qualifier feel heavier than the statement. Off the record, this portion of the proceeding is confidential. Court reporter, stop transcription. The reporter's hands lifted from the keys, and the absence of that quiet rhythmic clicking created a void that felt louder than any sound that had come before it. The next evaluator didn't arrive through the courtroom's main doors or announce himself to the clerk. He entered from the judge's private corridor, the one that connected chambers to secured hallways most of the public never saw, and that detail alone reset the gravity of everything that had happened in the previous 90 minutes. He wasn't wearing a lanyard. He didn't carry a briefcase or a tablet or any of the professional accessories the other evaluators had used to establish their credentials. He carried a single slim digital recorder, the kind designed for field work rather than courtroom testimony. And when he stepped to the front of the room, he didn't introduce himself with a name. He gave a role. Federal Agent, Interstate Labor Trafficking and Industrial Fraud Task Force, he said, speaking directly to Judge Harlow and no one else. I need to run one test for identification purposes. It won't take long. Judge Harlow's face had lost all color, and the way she nodded, once, sharply, without asking for clarification or demanding credentials, told everyone watching that she'd just received an order disguised as a request. She didn't say proceed or granted or any of the formal language that would normally accompany allowing an unscheduled party to address the court. She just nodded again, and the agent placed the recorder on the prosecution's table without looking at Prosecutor Slocum, who had gone completely still in a way that suggested she was trying very hard not to draw attention to herself. The audio he played didn't sound like the courtroom exercises from earlier. It didn't have the clean, deliberate pacing of language instruction or the formal structure of legal depositions. It sounded like two men coordinating something they didn't want documented, speaking in a compressed hybrid of Spanish and operational shorthand that belonged to people who moved between jurisdictions faster than paperwork could follow. The words weren't academic. They were logistical, times, routes, county lines, the kind of information that mattered when you needed to know which sheriff's office would respond to a call and which one wouldn't have jurisdiction until you crossed a specific intersection. Khalil listened with his eyes closed, and the agent didn't ask him to translate it into English. He asked him to translate it into formal Spanish first, then explain why the speaker was deliberately avoiding naming the county. The question wasn't designed to test comprehension. It was designed to see if Khalil understood why the avoidance mattered, which meant understanding enforcement geography, labor movement patterns, and the invisible boundaries that separated safe corridors from ones where trucks got stopped and manifests got examined. Khalil opened his eyes, inhaled once, and then did something that erased any remaining possibility that this courtroom had ever been about contempt or interpreter disputes. He's saying Pinal, Khalil said quietly, his voice steady but careful, like he was aware that every word was being weighed for meanings beyond syntax. Not Maricopa. The pickup wasn't in Phoenix. It was south of Casa Grande, probably near the agricultural corridor off State, Route 87. He's doing it on purpose because the route matters. If you think it's Phoenix, you assume Maricopa County Sheriff would respond. But if it's Pinal County, that's a different jurisdiction, different response times, different enforcement priorities. That's not a translation detail. That's operational knowledge. The agent's expression didn't change. He didn't nod or smile or give any indication that Khalil had answered correctly, but Judge Harlow's face told a different story. Her hands had moved to the edge of the bench, gripping it with enough force that her knuckles had gone white, and her eyes flicked from Khalil to the agent and back again with the rapid calculation of someone trying to figure out how much trouble she was in for staging a public competency test on a person the federal government had already identified. Prosecutor Slocum turned slowly toward the agent, and the look on her face wasn't confusion. It was the cold realization that her case had been built on top of a file she'd never been cleared to open, and now someone with clearance had just walked into her courtroom and demonstrated exactly how much she didn't know. The agent picked up his recorder and spoke again, this time with the measured tone of someone delivering information that would later become part of a sealed record. The corridor he just described connects labor transit between the Port of Newark in Essex County, New Jersey, through poultry processing facilities outside Springdale in Washington County, Arkansas, then to packaging yards in Shelby County, Tennessee, before reaching distribution hubs near Phoenix. Those aren't tourist destinations. Those are points on a supply chain where labor moves faster than payroll records, and where injuries get classified as accidents because nobody with authority wants to investigate the routes. Subscribe before you miss how a single word can rewrite someone's entire history. Khalil's public defender turned toward him like she was seeing him for the first time, and the expression on her face carried equal parts shock and betrayal, because in 3 months of pretrial meetings he had never once mentioned that he could identify county boundaries from audio compression patterns or explain enforcement jurisdiction splits based on highway routes. Iris Tremaine had been defending a man she thought was an ordinary compliance worker who'd gotten caught up in a bad situation, and now she was sitting next to someone who knew details that didn't come from warehouse shifts or safety briefings. They came from proximity to a network the government had been tracking across state lines. Judge Harlow called a recess without setting a return time, which was procedurally irregular and practically an admission that she needed instructions from someone above her authority level before continuing. She stood, walked into her chambers without dismissing the court, and left the bailiff staring at Khalil with an expression caught between suspicion and uncertainty. When Khalil finally stood to follow Iris toward the holding area, 2 federal marshals appeared from the hallway. Not the county deputies who had been watching him all morning, but marshals in dark suits with earpieces and the kind of situational awareness that made it clear they'd been present in the building long before anyone in the courtroom had known to look for them. They flanked Khalil as he walked, not restraining him, but positioning themselves close enough that their intent was ambiguous: protection or containment, defense or custody, and no one in that courthouse could tell the difference anymore. Avery sat on a wooden bench in the courthouse hallway while adults moved past her without asking her name or why she was alone, and the procedural indifference wasn't negligence. It was the system functioning exactly as designed, treating children like attachments to cases rather than people who needed someone to check if they had a ride home or a phone number to call or any plan that didn't involve sitting on polished floors waiting for strangers to decide their futures. The bench was too high for her feet to reach the ground, so her legs dangled in a way that made her look younger than 12, and her backpack sat next to her like a barricade against a world that had stopped making sense 3 hours ago when her father had stood up in a courtroom and challenged a judge who'd already decided he was guilty. A deputy stood 15 feet away, close enough to watch her, but far enough to pretend he wasn't responsible if something happened, and his radio crackled intermittently with dispatches about other courtrooms and other cases, static-filled voices discussing people like they were file numbers instead of lives. Avery had her inhaler out now, turning it over in her hands without using it, the plastic smooth and warm from being gripped too long, and the motion was automatic, the kind of repetitive gesture people develop when they need something to do with their hands while their minds process fear they're not allowed to express aloud. Inside the holding room down the corridor, Khalil stood with his back against a concrete wall while Iris Tremaine paced in front of him, her voice low and urgent in a way that suggested she was finally asking the questions she should have asked 3 months ago. Why didn't you tell me you could do this? Why didn't you tell me you had this kind of knowledge? She wasn't angry. She was terrified, because public defenders learn early that when the federal government shows up to a county case unannounced, it means their client has been part of something larger than the charges on paper, and larger cases come with risks that don't show up in plea negotiations or sentencing guidelines. Khalil didn't answer immediately. He was listening to the muffled voices coming from the room next door, the one where Judge Harlow had disappeared with the federal agent 20 minutes ago, and through the thin walls he caught fragments of conversation that didn't sound like legal consultation. They sounded like damage control. One phrase came through clearly enough to make his jaw tighten. We didn't expect him to be this fluent. Not, we didn't expect him to pass the test. Not, we didn't expect him to be competent. Fluent. The word carried implications that went beyond courtroom translation, and Khalil understood that whoever had set this day in motion had underestimated what he could do, which meant they'd also underestimated what he knew. The deputy in the hallway received a text message, glanced at his phone, then looked at Avery with an expression that had shifted from casual supervision to something more attentive, more calculating. He moved 3 steps closer to where she sat, repositioning himself so that he was between her and the main exit, and the change was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but clear enough to Avery that she pulled her backpack onto her lap and wrapped both arms around it like a shield. The door to the holding room opened, and the federal agent stepped out first, followed by Judge Harlow, whose face had lost the confident authority she'd worn all morning and now carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd just been reminded that her courtroom operated at the discretion of people with jurisdiction that extended far beyond Franklin County. The agent walked toward Khalil with the kind of deliberate calm that made every movement feel rehearsed, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that Iris had to lean in to hear him. "The contempt charge is being dropped," he said, and the words landed like oxygen after drowning. "You're free to take your daughter home today. No additional charges. No referral. The matter is closed." Khalil exhaled, and the sound carried 9 years of single-parent fear in a single breath. Avery heard it from the hallway and looked up, her expression shifting from braced resignation to something fragile and hopeful, the kind of hope children learn not to trust but can't help feeling anyway when adults finally say something that sounds like safety. She smiled for the first time all day, small and tentative, like testing whether the world had actually shifted or if this was just another temporary reprieve before the next crisis. Then the agent added, almost as an afterthought, "But before you leave, there's something you need to see." He pulled a second file from inside his jacket, thinner than the first, and slid it onto the table between them with the careful precision of someone handling evidence that could still cut if touched wrong. This isn't about the court case anymore. The relief that had filled the room 10 seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a colder and more dangerous understanding that the contempt hearing had never been the real threat. It had been misdirection, a way to get Khalil into a room where the federal government could confirm what they suspected and then show him why that confirmation mattered. Iris Tremaine's face went pale, and her hand moved to her briefcase like she was already preparing to argue jurisdiction or client privilege. But the agent's expression made it clear that whatever was in that file existed outside the boundaries of county law and public defender representation. Judge Harlow stood in the doorway to her chambers, and from that distance Khalil couldn't hear what she said to the agent. But he could see her mouth move around a single question, and he could see the agent's response. A slight shake of his head, definitive and final, and then the judge's shoulders sagged in a way that suggested she'd just been told her courtroom had been used for a purpose she hadn't understood until it was too late to stop it. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment when the people in power realized they were never in control. The agent opened the file to the first page, and Khalil's eyes dropped to a photograph clipped to the top, an old military ID photo, the kind that reduced a person to rank and function, and the name beneath the image wasn't his. It was a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 7 years, a name his daughter didn't know belonged to anyone real because he'd told her the person was gone, and the shock of seeing it in federal documentation made his vision narrow at the edges. "The explosion isn't the center of this," the agent said, voice measured and deliberate. "Macy O'Tull's death was part of a pattern. and the person who was tracking that pattern before she disappeared. He tapped the photograph once. Is the reason you're standing here. The photograph showed a woman in a military uniform with a linguist identifier pinned to her collar, and the name beneath it was Raina Sutter, which was Avery's mother's maiden name. The name Khalil had stopped using after she died, because hearing it made his daughter ask questions about a person she'd barely known and a loss he hadn't figured out how to explain in ways that wouldn't damage her. The file listed her as a confidential source in a sealed investigation out of King County, Washington, and the case number format matched the envelope Judge Harlow had received an hour earlier, which meant the federal government had been tracking this connection long before Khalil walked into a Franklin County courtroom and corrected a translation that wasn't supposed to be correctable. Khalil's hands went still on the table, not from calm, but from the kind of shock that freezes the body before the mind catches up, and Iris Tremaine leaned over to read the document before he could stop her. Her face changed as she processed what the file was saying. Not confusion, but the slow, horrified realization that her client's dead wife hadn't died in a car accident on Interstate 5 outside Seattle the way Khalil had told his daughter for 7 years. The crash had been real, but the death had been a cover to move Raina off-grid after she'd translated a set of intercepted communications that named supervisors, not contractors, as the people selecting which industrial sites would fail and which workers would be present when the failures occurred. The agent pulled a second document from the file, a page dense with redactions and coded references, and slid it toward Khalil without commentary. The few unredacted sections referenced facilities in 4 states. A poultry processing plant outside Springdale in Washington County, Arkansas, that had experienced an ammonia leak 3 years ago, a packaging warehouse in Cook County, Illinois, where a conveyor malfunction killed 2 workers, a detention transport vehicle in Frio County, Texas, that crashed under circumstances the investigation had classified as mechanical failure pending review, and the Grove City warehouse explosion that had brought Khalil into this courtroom. The pattern wasn't obvious unless you understood that the people who died in each incident had been scheduled for interviews with labor enforcement officials the following week, and that their deaths had closed investigations before they could escalate to federal indictments. Khalil's jaw tightened, and when he looked up from the document, the federal agent was watching him with the kind of attention that suggested he'd been waiting for this exact reaction. Your wife translated communications that identified the supervisors coordinating these incidents across state lines, the agent said quietly. She was moved into protective status after the first attempt on her life, and the car crash was staged to make anyone looking for her believe she was already gone. The problem is, she's been missing for 18 months now. Not from us. From the people who wanted to silence her. Judge Harlow had moved closer to the doorway, and her face carried an expression Khalil couldn't quite read, part alarm, part calculation, and something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. She'd spent the morning treating him like a defendant manufacturing evidence, but now she was standing in a room where the federal government had just confirmed that her courtroom had been used as a net to flush out a translator with enough operational knowledge to finish what his wife had started, and the humiliation she'd staged for public consumption had become something darker and more dangerous than she'd intended. Prosecutor Slocum appeared in the hallway, her face pale, and she spoke to the agent rather than the judge, which was a violation of courtroom hierarchy that nobody corrected because everyone understood the normal rules didn't apply anymore. How long have you been tracking him? She asked, voice tight. How long have you been waiting for him to correct something in public so you could identify him? The agent didn't answer, which was an answer in itself, and Slocum's expression shifted from fear to anger because she'd built a case she thought was about criminal negligence and industrial safety violations, and now she was learning that her office had been used to create a situation where Khalil would be forced to demonstrate competence the federal government needed to confirm. The entire morning, the contempt threat, the evaluators, the escalating tests, hadn't been about justice or truth. It had been about forcing Khalil to reveal knowledge he'd been hiding because revealing it would put his daughter at risk. Khalil's voice came out quieter than he intended, and the question he asked wasn't the one anyone expected. Does Avery know? He wasn't asking if his daughter knew about the investigation or the sealed files or the federal surveillance. He was asking if she knew her mother wasn't dead, And the way the agent hesitated before answering told Khalil everything he needed to know about how much the government was willing to sacrifice for operational security. No, the agent said finally. And you have a choice to make about whether she ever does. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, and the shift in posture made the next words feel heavier than anything that had come before. We can keep this sealed. You take your daughter home, you go back to work, and you never hear from us again. Or you help us decode the communications your wife left behind. Phrases that look harmless unless you understand how route workers talk, and we finish the investigation she started. But if you choose that, you paint a target on both of you, because the people who wanted her gone will figure out you're continuing her work. The cruelty of the choice wasn't that both answers were dangerous. It was that either answer could ruin Avery's life. Ignorance might keep her safe, but would mean living with a lie that would eventually surface and destroy her trust, while the truth would make her a liability to people who had already demonstrated they were willing to kill witnesses. Khalil looked at Iris, who had gone completely silent because there was no legal advice that applied to a situation where the government was offering protection in exchange for cooperation that could get her client killed. And then he looked toward the hallway where his daughter sat waiting for someone to tell her she could go home. The agent slid one more document across the table, and this one wasn't redacted. It was a handwritten note in a language Khalil recognized immediately, not because it was Spanish or French or any of the languages he'd been tested on that morning, but because it was the hybrid operational shorthand Reyna had taught him when they first met, the coded phrasing they'd used to discuss work situations that were too dangerous to document in ways employers could subpoena. The note was dated 6 weeks ago, which meant Reyna had been alive recently, and the first line read, "Tell Khalil the second voice on the Grove City recording is the one who ordered the transfer that failed in Hennepin County." Khalil's hands started shaking, and this time he didn't try to hide it. The agent didn't lecture or explain. He unfolded a routing map across the table in the courthouse holding room, the paper creased from repeated handling and marked with highlighter tracks that connected cities across 6 states in a pattern that looked random until you understood it represented labor movement corridors where official documentation lagged 3 to 6 months behind actual transfers. Khalil leaned forward, and his eyes moved across the map with the kind of recognition that came from living the routes rather than studying them. Because he'd driven half of these highways for work, had sat in dispatch offices in Columbus and Reynoldsburg waiting for manifest corrections, had watched trucks get rerouted through Dublin and Whitehall when inspections tightened at primary checkpoints along Interstate 270. The agent placed 3 incident reports on top of the map, arranging them side by side so the dates and locations aligned in a way that forced comparison. The first was the Grove City warehouse explosion that killed Maceo Tull. The second was from a poultry processing facility outside Springdale, Arkansas, where an ammonia compressor had failed during a night shift, killing 1 worker and hospitalizing 6 others. The third was from a packaging yard in Shelby County, Tennessee, where a forklift brake system malfunctioned and crushed a temporary employee against a loading dock. The reports were formatted differently because they came from different jurisdictions, but Khalil's eyes caught the detail that mattered. The language used in the investigative summaries was identical. Not similar. Identical. The same phrases describing equipment failure, the same timeline structure noting no prior warnings, the same investigator signatures certifying the findings as complete and uncontestable. Khalil's finger moved to the Arkansas report first, tracing a line through the text where the phrase "mechanical degradation consistent with normal" appeared in a sentence structure he'd seen before. And then he found the same phrase in the Tennessee report, and then again in the Grove City file. The repetition wasn't accidental. It was template language, the kind that gets copied and pasted when someone needs to generate documentation that looks thorough but avoids the specific details that would invite follow-up questions. And beneath each signature line was a timestamp that showed the reports had been filed within 48 hours of the incidents, which meant the investigations had concluded before evidence could be independently verified, before witnesses could be re-interviewed, before anyone outside the immediate facility management could ask why 3 separate accidents in 3 different states had been documented using the exact same phrasing. Iris Tremaine was reading over his shoulder, and her breathing had gone shallow in a way that suggested she was finally understanding the scope of what her client had been pulled into. "These aren't accidents," she said quietly. These are cover stories with a shared author. The agent pulled out a fourth document. This one an audio transcript from a safety briefing recorded at the Grove City facility 3 weeks before the explosion. The transcript wasn't part of the official investigation file. It had been subpoenaed separately as part of the federal labor trafficking case. And when the agent pressed play on a portable speaker, Khalil's entire body went rigid. The recording was poor quality, compressed, and distant, but the voice delivering the briefing was instantly recognizable because Khalil had heard it dozens of times during shift changes and compliance meetings, and more importantly, he'd heard it on the phone call the night before Maceo Tull died. It was the second voice from the recording in Chapter 2, the one the court-appointed interpreter had never acknowledged because acknowledging it would have required explaining why a facility supervisor was discussing evacuation protocols in a language the company claimed none of the management spoke. "That's Leonard Voss," Khalil said, and the name came out flat and certain. He was the operations supervisor at Grove City. He's the one who told Maceo the building was cleared for entry even though the gas readings were elevated. And he's the voice on that phone call telling someone the transfer failed in Hennepin County. The connection locked into place as he said it. The transfer, Raina's note had referenced, wasn't about moving equipment or inventory. It was about a worker who was supposed to be relocated before an inspection but had stayed on-site and survived an incident that was meant to be fatal, and Leonard Voss had been coordinating which workers stayed and which ones were moved to safety. The agent's expression didn't change, but he wrote the name down in careful block letters and underlined it twice, which was the only confirmation Khalil needed that he'd just identified someone the federal investigation had been trying to locate through official channels for months. Iris looked at the routing map again, her eyes moving across the highlighted corridors, and when she spoke, her voice carried a different kind of fear than it had an hour ago. "How many people are involved in this? How many facilities?" The agent didn't answer directly, but he tapped 3 locations on the map that weren't highlighted yet. One in Fayetteville, North Carolina, near a series of distribution centers in Cumberland County. One in the Savannah corridor through Chatham County, Georgia, where port traffic created dense labor transit. And one back in Arizona near Casa Grande that Khalil had identified in the earlier audio test. "We're still mapping it," the agent said. "But your client just gave us the first confirmed name tied to 3 separate incidents. That's prosecutable." Khalil pulled the map closer and traced his finger along Interstate 70 from Columbus toward Indianapolis, then south along routes he'd driven for work assignments that had never made sense at the time. Why a compliance inspector from Ohio was being sent to audit facilities in Arkansas, why his recommendations were being filed and then ignored, why the same plants kept appearing on safety violation lists without ever being shut down. He'd thought it was bureaucratic dysfunction. Now he understood it was coordination, and his proximity to it hadn't been coincidence. It had been engineered, either to use him as cover or to see if he'd recognize what his wife had been tracking before she disappeared. Maceo Tull had a family, Khalil said quietly, not looking up from the map. 2 daughters, a wife who worked night shift at a hospital in Whitehall. I met them at the memorial service. I'm not doing this to clear my name. I'm doing this so someone is held accountable for what happened to him. The holding room door opened, and a courthouse security officer stepped in, his radio crackling with static. He looked at the federal agent, not Khalil, and his voice carried the kind of urgency that suggested the information couldn't wait for a more convenient moment. "We've got a vehicle in the employee parking lot. Gray sedan, Ohio plates, registered to a shell company out of Montgomery County. Driver's been sitting there for 40 minutes, hasn't exited the car. Matches the description from the dependent's earlier statement." Khalil's head snapped up. "Avery described a man in the parking lot 2 weeks ago. Gray car." She said. He smiled at her. The agent stood, already moving toward the door, and his hand went to his radio as he issued instructions in the clipped shorthand of someone coordinating a response across multiple units. "Get the child to a secure location. Now." Avery was already standing when the federal marshals reached the hallway bench, and the expression on her face carried the kind of controlled terror that comes from recognizing danger before adults have finished explaining it. One of the marshals crouched to her eye level and spoke in the calm, rehearsed tone people use when they're trying not to scare children while simultaneously preparing them for something frightening. But Avery cut him off mid-sentence with words that made every adult in that corridor freeze. "The man from the parking lot is here," she said, voice steady in a way that shouldn't have been possible for someone her age. The one who's been watching me. Khalil came out of the holding room fast enough that Iris had to grab her briefcase to keep up, and when he reached his daughter, he dropped to one knee and put both hands on her shoulders, not gripping but anchoring. "Where did you see him?" he asked, keeping his voice level even though his pulse was hammering in his ears. "I didn't see him today," Avery said. "I saw his car through the window 10 minutes ago. Same gray car. He was parked where the employees park, and he was looking at the building." She paused, then added with the terrible clarity of a child who had learned to track patterns adults try to hide from her. "He's been outside my school 3 times in the past 2 weeks. He never gets out. He just sits there." The federal agent appeared in the hallway, already coordinating with courthouse security through his radio, and his face carried the tight focus of someone managing a situation that had just escalated from theoretical threat to active surveillance. He looked at Khalil, then at Avery, and made a decision that didn't require consultation. "We're moving you both now. Not through the main exits. There's a service corridor that connects to the parking structure. We'll use that." They moved quickly but without the dramatic urgency that would have drawn attention. 2 marshals in front, 2 behind, the agent beside Khalil, and Iris trailing at a distance that suggested she understood she was being allowed to accompany them as a courtesy rather than a right. The corridor was narrow and utilitarian, lit by emergency lighting that made everyone's faces look pale and angular, and the concrete walls amplified every footstep into something that sounded like a countdown. Avery kept her backpack clutched to her chest and her eyes on her father's back, and Khalil could feel her fear radiating through the space between them like heat. They exited into an unmarked vehicle in the covered section of the parking structure, and the agent drove them north on State Route 33 toward Dublin without explanation, his eyes checking the mirrors with the kind of practiced frequency that suggested he'd done this extraction enough times to have developed instincts about pursuit patterns. Khalil turned in his seat to look through the rear window, but the agent's voice stopped him. "Don't. If they're following, looking back tells them you know they're there. Just sit forward and trust that we'll see them before they get close." The safe interview room was in a commercial office building off France Road in Dublin, designed to look like generic corporate space so that neighbors wouldn't question the irregular hours or the security cameras positioned at angles that covered every approach. The agent led them to a conference room on the 3rd floor, and the moment the door closed, Khalil felt the shift in pressure, not physical, but psychological, the difference between being watched in public and being secured in a space designed for conversations the government didn't want documented outside controlled channels. The agent placed Raina's handwritten notes on the table, 3 pages of coded phrases that looked like innocuous work observations unless you understood the operational shorthand route workers use to communicate risks without creating written evidence employers could use to fire them. Khalil stared at the first page, and the language came back to him in fragments. Phrases Raina had taught him during late-night conversations when Avery was asleep, and they'd sit at the kitchen table translating safety briefings that contradicted the official versions their employers distributed. "This phrase," Khalil said, pointing to a line halfway down the 2nd page, means someone altered the manifest after the truck left the facility. The original load was documented at 42 pallets, but the phrase count-adjusted at checkpoint means someone added weight between departure and arrival. That's how they moved people, hidden in shipping containers that looked like standard freight. Iris had gone completely still, and her face carried the expression of someone watching evidence of federal crimes accumulate in real time with her client as the only witness capable of translating them. The agent was writing furiously, and when Khalil pointed out a second phrase that connected the Grove City facility to a transfer route through Hennepin County that had failed 18 months ago, the same failure Raina's earlier note had referenced, the agent's pen stopped moving, and he looked up with an intensity that suggested Khalil had just named someone specific. "Who was the supervisor overseeing that transfer?" the agent asked. Khalil traced his finger down the page, found the reference buried in a string of seemingly unrelated observations about equipment inspections, and then spoke the name with the careful precision of someone who understood that saying it aloud would make everything that followed inevitable. "Deputy Director Garrett Prine, Ohio Department of Labor. He's the one who signed off on the Grove City facility inspections 6 months before the explosion. And according to this, He's the one who ordered Leonard Voss to keep Maceo Tull on site the night of the blast. The room went silent, and the silence carried the weight of a revelation that couldn't be walked back, because Garrett Prine wasn't some mid-level supervisor whose arrest would make regional news and disappear in a week. He was a state official with connections to county prosecutors and judges across Ohio, which meant exposing him would require dismantling networks that had been protecting him for years, and anyone involved in that dismantling would become a target for retaliation that extended far beyond courthouse parking lots. Khalil looked at Avery, who was sitting in a chair by the window with her backpack still on her lap, and he understood that the choice the agent had offered him an hour ago hadn't actually been a choice at all. It had been a preview of consequences that were already in motion. Judge Patrice Harlow returned to the bench 3 hours later with the careful posture of someone who had spent the afternoon being reminded that her authority existed at the discretion of people who could reassign her to traffic court if she created problems they couldn't contain. She didn't smile. She didn't perform. She read from a prepared statement with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that every word would be reviewed by federal attorneys looking for procedural errors that could compromise a larger investigation, and the laughter she'd deployed that morning, the dismissive sound designed to humiliate a black single father for challenging her courtroom, now looked obscene in a way that would follow her through every future docket where defendants wondered if she was staging justice or participating in operations she didn't control. The charges against Mr. Benning are continued pending further review, she said, eyes on the paper rather than the defendant. Portions of this proceeding are sealed by federal order. Jurisdictional authority has been transferred to the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Ohio. This court is adjourned. Khalil stood, and Iris Tremaine stood beside him, but neither of them spoke because the outcome wasn't a victory. It was a deferral, a bureaucratic placeholder that meant Khalil would spend the next 6 months waiting to find out if cooperation had bought him protection or just delayed the consequences until the people threatened by his testimony could organize a more permanent solution. Prosecutor Nina Slocum had already left the courtroom, and the speed of her exit suggested she'd been instructed not to comment on a case that was no longer hers to prosecute, and Judge Harlow disappeared into chambers without dismissing anyone formally, leaving the bailiff to clear the room with a silence that felt heavier than any gavel strike. Outside the courthouse, Khalil carried Avery's backpack because she'd finally let go of it, and they walked toward the parking structure where a federal agent had told them they could retrieve Khalil's car under marshal supervision. Avery was quiet, not from exhaustion, but from the kind of processing children do when they've watched adults fail to protect them and need to recalibrate what safety means in a world where courtrooms and school parking lots are equally dangerous. Khalil wanted to tell her it was over, that they could go home and return to the routines that had defined their lives before a warehouse explosion and a mistranslated verb had pulled them into a system that traded human lives for jurisdictional convenience. But he couldn't say any of those things because none of them were true. "I won't let them turn Maceo Tull's death into paperwork," Khalil said instead, speaking to his daughter but also to himself, because the decision he'd made in that Dublin conference room hadn't been about heroism or vindication. It had been about refusing to let a system erase people by reclassifying murder as mechanical failure and calling the erasure justice. The documentary truth was larger than Franklin County or Grove City or any single courtroom. It stretched across the port of Newark in Essex County, New Jersey, where labor moved through manifests that didn't match the people unloading containers. It reached into poultry plants outside Springdale in Washington County, Arkansas, where workers were scheduled for interviews they never survived to attend. It connected packaging yards in Shelby County, Tennessee, to distribution hubs near Casa Grande in Pinal County, Arizona, to a sealed investigation in King County, Washington, where Raina Sutter had translated the pattern before someone tried to silence her. And now Khalil was continuing the work she'd started, not because he was brave, but because the alternative was teaching his daughter that survival meant looking away when people were being killed in plain sight. They drove home in silence, and Avery fell asleep in the passenger seat with her head against the window. And when they pulled into the driveway of their rental house in Whitehall, Khalil carried her inside the way he'd carried her when she was small enough to fit in one arm. He laid her on the couch, pulled a blanket over her shoulders, and sat in the kitchen with Raina's notes spread across the table, Trying to decode the remaining phrases before exhaustion made the letters blur into meaningless shapes. 2 hours later, Avery woke up and walked into the kitchen, and Khalil looked up expecting her to ask for water or permission to watch television. But instead she stood in the doorway and said something that made his blood stop moving. It was a phrase in the hybrid operational shorthand Reyna had used, a string of words that meant nothing to most people, but carried specific instructions about routing changes and checkpoint timing to anyone who understood the code. Avery said it perfectly, pronunciation exact, and then added in a voice too calm for the moment. The man in the parking lot taught me that. He said if I ever needed help, I should say it to someone who looked like they worked at a warehouse. Khalil's hands went still on the notes, and the realization landed with the weight of something that couldn't be undone. The Watcher hadn't just been surveilling his daughter. He'd been preparing her, teaching her language that would identify her to the same network that had tried to silence her mother, and the threat hadn't stayed in courthouse parking lots or school drop-off zones. It had crossed into their home, into Avery's memory, into the space between what Khalil could protect and what he couldn't see coming until it was already too late.